Hello. We are honored to have as our guest speaker today someone who has become a good friend of cameras, the brilliant and insightful Dr. Michael Doran, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute in Washington and Director of its Center for Peace and Security in the Middle East. If you're somehow not familiar with Hudson's work, you should go to their site at hudson.org to see the impressive breadth and depth of their research. Mike was born in Kokomo, Indiana, but grew up in California, earning his BA at Stanford and then his MA and PhD at Princeton in Near Eastern Studies, where he was research assistant to the legendary Bernard Lewis. Mike has held a number of academic positions, including as professor of history at Princeton, before joining the George W. Bush administration in the area of Middle East policy, holding high-level positions at the National Security Council, the State Department, and the Pentagon. He has written many influential articles and books, including in 2002, a very important interpretation of bin Laden's motives for 9/11 entitled Somebody Else's Civil War, published in Foreign Affairs. His first book was Pan-Arabism Before Nasser, Egyptian Power Politics and the Palestine Question. And his most recent is Ike's Gamble, America's Rise to Dominance in the Middle East, centering on Eisenhower's desire to remake relations with Egypt amidst the 1956 war involving Egypt, France, the UK, and Israel as combatants. Michael will be giving us an overview of the current anti-regime disturbances in Iran, how they compare to earlier episodes, the role of Iran's large minority groups in the unrest, and whether the unrest will coalesce into a revolution or even an insurrection, if I can use that term, along with the policy implications for the US, for the Iran nuclear deal, and for Israel. Mike, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alex, for that kind introduction, and thanks to all of you for tuning in, and thanks to Camera for all the good work that it does. Let me just start by asking a simple question. Are we witnessing a revolution or yet another wave of protests like we saw before, back in 2009? And a couple of times in between. My really decisive answer is I do not know. This could well be, it could well be the beginning of a revolution, or it might just be the worst wave of protests that we've ever seen. Worst meaning the most extensive. They certainly are that. We have they have been, this is the longest in duration a protest that we've ever seen. I think it's probably the widest in terms of participation. It is happening in all cities of Iran, among all ethnic groups, and happening simultaneously. It also is clearly a protest directed against the regime. These are not protests for reform. They're protests for regime change. And they began as a protest against the hijab, but the hijab itself is the symbol of the regime. If there's no prohibition on women covering themselves, you don't have the Islamic Republic. So there has been an attempt by some of the people in the West, less and less they've come under pressure, but there was an attempt by people who are more sympathetic to the regime, or let's just say want to engage the regime, to define this early on as a protest for women's rights reforms. But I don't think they were ever that at all. These are anti-regime protests. And as I say, they are the most, these are the most severe protests we've seen. People also are willing to go directly at the security services in a way that we haven't seen before. So all of that suggests that we're moving toward a revolutionary situation, but there are a couple of things we haven't seen, I think, that give me hesitation before I say this is a revolution. One, I haven't seen any obvious cracks in the regime. I think that's the thing we ought to be looking for when we see that, the Army and the IRGC, just to pick two different elements at random, are actually obviously in competition with each other and disagreeing. That's I think almost a prerequisite for it to become a revolutionary situation. Well, we also don't see any clear leadership. There can't be leadership on the ground because the repressive apparatus is too extensive for leadership to develop. But there really isn't any leadership on the outside either. And the third thing that we haven't seen, I think, are demonstrations big enough, given number one and number two, that we don't have an obvious split in the regime or leadership. We don't have, in order for it to become a revolutionary situation, we need protests that are big enough to actually really shut down the country and call into question the public order in a more extensive and sustained way. And we haven't seen that yet. I talked to a friend of mine who has an extensive contacts inside Iran. Particularly, he's Azerbaijani, and he has contacts into the Azerbaijani areas. I'm going to say more about that in a minute, in the Northwest. And I was particularly interested to know what was the size of the protests and why aren't we seeing bigger ones? And the answer was that people were waiting to see what happens. And particularly the Azerbaijanis, they're not Persians, they're Turks, Azerbaijani Turks, and they feel that in the last go around, meaning in 1979, they went out on the streets and then helped take down the Shah, only to get a new leader who was every bit as Persian nationalist from their point of view, because they're an ethnic minority, and every bit as Persian nationalist, and even more totalitarian or dictatorial. And so they don't want to make the same mistake again. So they're kind of waiting to see what happens before they go out. I thought that was very interesting insight that would not have occurred to me if I hadn't been talking to somebody who knew that. So those are the major indicators that I'm looking for: a crack in the regime, larger protests, and some kind of leadership to emerge, and that may yet happen. But having said all that, it's clear that this is the worst situation the regime has faced. It's clear that the regime is at an even narrower base than it had before. I remember giving a talk. It could have been for camera, I don't remember, back during the COVID crisis, and I said then that the base of the regime has gotten to its narrowest point ever, and now I think it's even narrower. We're in the I think the comparison with the final years of the Soviet Union is probably not a bad comparison. Nobody truly believes, or I shouldn't say nobody, but the percentage of people who truly believe the ideology of the regime is very small. And among those who pretend, there's a larger group that pretend to believe it, but they only do so because they feel like their own livelihood and their family's livelihood depends on the continuation of the existing order. And that brings me to another interesting dimension here. That's sort of it's not a completely unknown dimension, but it's a dimension that is very, very hard to gauge, and I think it's probably one of the most important things that we should be looking at. And that is the issue of ethnic minorities in Iran. Iran has 5 major ethnic minorities. It's a multi-ethnic, multi-religious country, but the 5 that matter the most are, number 1, I'll just go around the clock. 1, the Azerbaijanis, who are up in the northwest quadrant of Iran, right below the country of Azerbaijan. Below them, the Kurds. Below them, the Akhvazi Arabs. Then at the bottom, the Baluch, bottom east, and the Baluch go across over into Pakistan, and then up in the northeast, the Turkmen. By far, the most important are the Azerbaijanis. The Azerbaijanis make up about between 1/5 and 1/3 of the country, depending upon how you want to how you want to slice it. It's impossible, you know, in Middle Eastern countries. There's nothing more dangerous than reliable demographic data. So you can't really get it out of the governments. And you know, it's also just a matter of just the way people are. We are as human beings. You can be multiple different things. So it's not exactly clear what the number is, but it's very high. Somewhere, you know, a 1/5 is a very conservative estimate. It's clearly more than a 1/5, I think, more like a 1/4 or a 1/3. Now, that community is going through a period of, I'm trying to choose my words carefully. I'm going to say cultural effervescence. And the reason I'm using such a funny word is, you know, what I want to say is a kind of nationalist awakening, but I don't know that is true. What's happening there, and by this, in this I have no doubt whatsoever, is that younger Azerbaijani Turks in Iran want more connection with their Azerbaijani roots, more connection with their Turkish roots. They consume Turkish media from Turkey. They consume Azerbaijani media from Azerbaijan, and they want to be able. They are culturally oppressed. They can't use their language fully in public life the way they would like, and they would like definitely more cultural rights. How political they are remains to be seen. I mean, do they want to have autonomy, or do they want to have some kind of devolution of power and to be recognized from the political center? Do they want to secede? It's not clear. It's not clear at all. But something significant is going on there, and it has sped up as a result of the 2020 war between Azerbaijan and Armenia, which I went to witness firsthand. By the way, it was quite a dramatic victory by the Azerbaijanis, and the Iranian government actually intervened. It's not well known, but they actually intervened to prevent it. You know, for all that the Islamic Republic is professes to base its policies on the spreading of Islam, Iran is the ally of Armenia against Azerbaijan, precisely because there is this large Azerbaijani minority in Iran, and the authorities in Tehran fear it. I'm going to come back to that again in a minute because I want to talk a little bit about the geopolitics of all of this. But let me go back to just the minority question. One of the interesting things that's happened in the Islamic Republic in the last 20 years is that the ideology of the regime has shifted from Shiite or Islamic radicalism to a kind of a hybrid. And this is a result of the fact that the regime has gotten weaker. So it's now got 2 faces. One face is Islamic radical, and the other face is Persian nationalist. And so one of the goals or one of the tactics of the regime in all of this is to say to the Persians, who make up only around 50% of the population, possibly even less. But they want to say to the Persians, if we go down, you go down with us. So they wanted to be presented. They want to scare the Persians in Iran with the possibility of an ethnic uprising. It's very, very hard from the outside, sitting from the outside, to understand the extent to which how well that effort plays among the minorities. But one thing that we need to be aware of, those of us who are sitting outside as interested observers, is that almost every expert on Iran in the United States and in the West in general, and when I say in the United States, I mean inside the government and out, in academia, in the media, they are almost all Persians. There are very few. There are very few from the ethnic minorities, and they too, even if they're hostile to the Islamic Republic, they are hostile, or at least unwilling to discuss the minority issue. There is no issue that is more neuralgic than the question of minority rights. I tried. A colleague of mine from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Brenda Schaefer, she may be known to all of you. She got through contacts in Iran, the Iranian government data on the minorities. They went and they surveyed their own population and said, what language do you speak at home, and so on and so forth. She got this and she wrote a report on it, which I thought, this is about 2 years ago. I thought it was fascinating, and I wanted to do an event at Hudson, where I work, on it. And I asked a very large number of experts on Iran to come sit on a panel with Brenda Schaefer to talk about her data, and they didn't want to do it. They didn't want to do it. I got excuses, my father's ill, whatever. I got people who just didn't answer emails. I got one guy who called me up and he said, Mike, I'm going to tell you this because you're a friend. I think this is a very interesting topic. I think it's an important topic. But if I sit on that panel and discuss this is going to cause me no end of grief with my friends and even with my family. And so I just can't do it. And I really appreciated him telling me that. I guess I knew it anyway, but it was nice to have it confirmed. It's such an unbelievably neuralgic issue, but it's the one on which I think all of this is going to hinge in the end. I mean, this is such a different period we're living through now, and if you follow this closely, the worst violence so far that has been in the ethnic areas. When you see real violence, people being shot in large numbers, or in more than just one or two here and there, that's in Baluchistan, where there's actually an armed uprising. And then in Kurdistan, among the Akvazi Arabs, the regime takes a little bit of a lighter touch with the Azerbaijanis, because they fear them more than any. By the way, the Azerbaijanis, in addition to being the largest minority and to being geographically concentrated, all of the minorities are geographically concentrated, but the Azerbaijanis have a huge, they've been part of the Iranian system for a very, very long time, and they've been in at the highest levels. So they're well integrated, or they're better integrated than the other minorities, and they have positions of responsibility and power. I think historically, and I assume it's still true, the Bazaris, the merchants in Tehran, there's a very high percentage of them that are historically Azerbaijani. So the regime is going to use a lighter touch there, but it's still a problem for them. So this is one of the things that I want to watch most closely. It unfortunately, because all of the expertise on Iran is Persian, there's no talk of this minority question. When I wanted to do this panel at Hudson, my argument was the American government needs to understand the importance of these dynamics. And there is an argument out there, and it's quite a serious argument that Iran is actually a nation. There's an Iranian nation, and it's a multi-ethnic nation, not unlike the United States. That's not I don't think that that's a silly argument, but I can't get the different experts to sit and talk about the notion that it's not multi-ethnic, it is multi-ethnic, and so on, because it's such a toxic issue. Consequently, there's nobody in the government who's thinking about this at all, and the awareness of it is extremely small. But this is going to be a huge factor. This is going to be a huge factor going forward. And I have a scenario in my head. I'll just share it with you. This is really just me imagining in the future. When this regime starts to go down, what we're gonna, I suspect what we're gonna find is that the IRGC is going to very quickly become a kind of militia. It's going to become a kind of militia working for the Persians to frustrate whatever system is coming up and to come in behind the Persians. I expect there to be a lot of ethnic conflict as this thing unfolds, but I could be wrong about that. I mean, this is me just speculating a little bit wildly there, but I just want to highlight the importance of that issue to you because it's not getting the discussion that it deserves. Although, as I said, my friend Brenda Schaefer at FDD, she talks about this pretty extensively and has lots of information about it. Now, a little bit about American policy and the geopolitics of all of this, and then I'll come back to Alex. The Biden administration, as we all know, it came into office with the intention of cutting a deal with Iran, returning to the JCPOA. It believed that when it came into office, the regime was going to be so delighted to be done with Donald Trump that it was going to quickly embrace the administration and run back to the JCPOA. And that policy, I think now we can say, was a total failure. The administration, however, has not abandoned it. Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, said to a friend of mine when he was asked about the JCPOA, he said, it's comatose and we're going to leave it that way. Now, if the Iranians came, I wouldn't bank on that, on the second part of that statement, and we're going to leave it that way, because I think that if the Iranians came and dropped some of the demands that they have that have frustrated the Americans and the Europeans, I think the administration would consider running back to it in 2 seconds. It's been amazing. We have this now. We have Iranian drones in Iraq, not Iraq. What's the name of that country? Ukraine. Iranian drones in Ukraine. Probably Iranian missiles going to arrive in Ukraine. Openly, the administration openly admits that this is in violation of the UN Resolution 2331 that endorsed the JCPOA, and yet nobody is talking about, in the administration, at least as far as I have heard, is talking about snapback in the UN. Nobody is talking about even admitting publicly that the JCPOA is comatose. Now, why is that? Well, if they admitted that it's comatose or admitted that it's dead and that it's not working, then the immediate next question comes up, well, what are you going to do in place of the JCPOA? And they don't want to answer that question because the obvious answer is, well, we're going to have to put in economic and political pressure on the regime. We all know that they being the Biden administration, has given the regime soft sanctions relief. They haven't formally lifted the sanctions, so they can continue to stand in front of the cameras and say we're sanctioning the regime, but they are allowing the regime to sell oil to China. And they don't want to turn around and say, cut off the oil. And they don't want to do that for I think 4 reasons. Somebody once told me when I was a professor, starting out, a young professor, you should always have 3 reasons, don't have 4. I've never learned how to only have 3 reasons. I've got 4 here. So one reason is they don't want to take oil off the market because they want to keep the price of oil low. I believe that that's a deal between Biden and the progressives domestically to retard the fossil fuel industry in the United States. So they don't want to go gangbusters on American production like Trump did, and even aside from that question of whether I'm right or wrong about that deal on domestic production, they don't want to take oil off the market. Period. Number 2, they fear a military escalation, I won't go deeply into this right now. I just let you know I've got an article coming out with a co-authored article next week in Tablet Magazine, where I argue persuasively, I believe, of course, that Iran has shifted the balance of power conventionally. Forget about the nuclear question, but conventionally, they have shifted the balance of power in the Gulf against us and our allies. The United States is outgunned by the Iranians in the Persian Gulf. And if this were to escalate conflict with Iran, then we would very quickly find the military doesn't want to do the forced buildup in the Middle East that would be necessary to counter the Iranians. We've got a military that's looking at the conflict in Ukraine. We've got a military that's looking at the possibility of war in Taiwan. They don't want another problem, and they want the problem in the Middle East to not exist. That's 2. Reason number 3. The administration fears that the Iranians will push toward a nuclear weapon, and they want to avoid that. So the Iranians have actually deterred the administration to a certain extent with regard to their nuclear buildup. And then the 4th reason is simply ideologically and politically. The administration made not just the administration, going back to the Obama administration, the Obama-Biden team presented their diplomatic approach to the Iran question to be far superior to the maximum pressure of Donald Trump and any other alternative, and they presented any other alternative as war. And that became, not just a pragmatic policy position. It became a kind of totemic left-wing position. It's one of the sort of defining issues. If you're a Democrat, particularly a progressive Democrat, then you believe that you have a superior way to handle the Iranian issue, and the administration would have to go back on all that and say, no, we got that wrong. Just like they got Putin wrong in Ukraine to a certain extent. I think it's getting more and more obvious that they got fossil fuels wrong. They haven't admitted that, but here they're going to have to say we got Iran wrong too. They don't want to do that. And it's not simply a matter of it, being difficult. None of us likes to say we were wrong. It's always an unpleasant thing to do, just as an individual. But it means, practically Joe Biden has to go to war, metaphorically speaking, with the progressive wing of his party on this issue, and he doesn't need that. Just like the military doesn't want to go to war in the Middle East, or have a military buildup in the Middle East. A couple more words about the about the geopolitics of this, which I find fascinating. I'll just throw out a few quick points and then hand it back to Alex. One of them is that this is happening at a moment when Russia has been weakened significantly. So we kind of see all the cards are being reshuffled in the globe simultaneously. Oh, something I forgot to mention, pardon me, I have to go back when I was talking about the domestic situation in Iran. There's another thing that we should keep our eyes on, which is very interesting. Again, I don't know exactly how to interpret it. It's just very interesting. And that's that this is the beginning of a succession crisis for the Islamic Republic. Ali Khamenei is old. He's not in great health. He's not going to be with us much longer. And so the question is, who's going to succeed him? And that has come to the fore at the same moment that we have this incredible outburst of hostility to the regime from the streets. That is one of the areas that will open up the potential for splits in the regime. We need to watch that closely. Again, I don't know how that's going to unfold. Now, internationally, we also have this incredibly interesting moment because Russia is weak. Now, what does that mean with Russia being weak? Well, how does that impinge on Iran? In a couple of ways. One, we see Iran is becoming a major arms supplier to Russia. Who expected this? Like I said, I've got an article coming out next week about missiles and drones. The Iranians are now major producers of missiles and drones, and these are very effective systems. For years, the Iranian missiles were kind of a joke among weapons experts. They're not a joke anymore. These are serious systems, precision guided, and they have managed to create these systems while under severe economic sanctions. And so they are now actually supplying Russia while it is in one of the major arms producers in the world, while it is in the midst of a very, very high tempo war. So they're producing them on scale, which is also very significant. Those are only going to get that experience is only going to get better, and the Russians are going to put behind them, behind the defense industries of Iran, as much support as they can. So this is going to become a bigger and bigger problem, and this is not just a problem for Middle Eastern countries or Israel. This is a problem for the world now. Obviously, they're already on the eastern flank of NATO. I'm sorry, yeah, eastern flank of NATO. We're gonna find them elsewhere. They're selling missiles and drones certainly drones to Venezuela, probably missiles soon. The missiles are going to have. It won't be long before they have, if they don't already have, that they have the range to hit the United States. They are selling them to Armenia. They're talking about selling them to Algeria. They've sold them to Ethiopia. They're building a drone factory in Tajikistan. So this is a major issue, and I don't think the geostrategic significance of it has really soaked in. And nothing that the administration has to offer, like, for example, the JCPOA, is going to do anything to alleviate that problem. It's one of the mantras of the administration that everything gets worse if we don't have a JCPOA. That's not true. The JCPOA makes the drone and missile problem of the Iranians much worse than it is. I could go into details on that, but like I said, I got an article coming out on that. The second thing about this Russian weakness is that it strengthens Azerbaijan, the country of Azerbaijan. And something very, very dramatic happened this last week. It actually knocked my socks off. As I've told you, for some time, I've been going to Azerbaijan, and I'm about to go again next month. I think Azerbaijan is the strategically most important country that you've never heard of. I've already explained much of the reason for that, or part of the reason for that, and that is the fact that 1/3 of Iran is Azerbaijani. President Aliyev of Azerbaijan met with the head of the Organization of Turkic States this week, gave an interview in public in which he said, "We have a concern for Azerbaijanis who live beyond our borders, meaning Iran, and we will act to look after them. So he's laying a stake, or threatening the regime in Tehran, saying, you better be careful because we will intervene in your affairs if you crack down too hard. Now, why did he do this? Partly because that is their identity, and it's just part of who they are, but also because the Iranians have massed troops on the border with Azerbaijan and are threatening it. They are threatening it because there's a possibility of Azerbaijan and Armenia making peace. If they make peace, they will open up a transport and economic corridor between that will go across Armenia over to Turkey, not over to Nakhchivan, that's the exclave of Azerbaijan, and then on to Turkey. And that will create a corridor all the way to China that doesn't go through Iran, right? That Iran doesn't control, nor Russia. Russia will not control it either. Now, in the past, Russia has always been there to prevent this from happening, but Russia's not there anymore. So the Iranians are trying to put pressure on the Azerbaijanis. Now, I'm going to end here with one more thing, and just think about this. And this will, I hope your head spins when I tell you this. To me, this is the most exciting part of the whole episode, and that is about a month ago, Benny Gantz went to Baku, the Israeli defense minister, for high-level meetings. Shortly after he left, Hulusi Akar, the defense minister of Turkey, went to Baku and brought the top generals of the Turkish generals there. Now, for those of you who are not following it, Azerbaijan is an ally of Israel and Turkey simultaneously. A very good ally of both. Israel gets about between 20 and 30% of its oil from Azerbaijan. And you can, from the Israeli point of view, because of the reach that the Azerbaijanis have into Iran along the lines of what I'm just talking, you can see why this is a very strategic relationship for the Israelis. So Benny Gantz went to Baku, and then Hulusi Akar went to Baku. Today, if you're following it, Benny Gantz is in Ankara, meeting not just with Hulusi Akar, but also with President Erdogan. I happen to know from an Israeli contact in the Israeli government that Benny Gantz canceled a meeting in Greece in order to go take these meetings in Ankara. And you know that Israeli-Greek relations have improved greatly over the last few years, and that's a strategic relationship for Israel. So Benny Gantz wouldn't insult the Greeks and go to Turkey if there wasn't something significant being discussed there. I'm sure, absolutely sure, that Iran and Azerbaijan is part of that discussion. I would love to be a fly on the wall. And in case you're just reading the tea leaves, the Israeli ambassador to Baku met with the Azerbaijani national security advisor today, and they put out a picture of their meeting and said that they were talking about issues of mutual concern. So the signaling here couldn't be stronger. The things have changed so quickly and in a very dizzying way. Turkish and Israeli interests, particularly with regard to Azerbaijan, but I think also with Syria, have aligned. I believe that this is the basis for a long-term alignment. I don't believe that this is a fleeting thing. I could be wrong. Stranger things have happened in the Middle East. But certainly until this, as long as this horrible regime in Tehran remains there, I think that we're going to see closer and closer relations between Turkey and Israel with respect to Azerbaijan. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Mike, for that penetrating analysis. There are a number of questions, and I'll try to synthesize some of them. You mentioned the illness of Khamenei. There's an interesting parallel, of course, going back to the last year of the Shah's rule. We saw then strikes by oil workers and by other important segments of the economy. We saw strikes by the Bazaris in Tehran against the regime. We saw a lot of bloodshed in the streets. And one thing that was notable is that the funerals would lead to more demonstrations, which would lead to more bloodshed. So that's exponential growth, because one death, one funeral would lead to multiple deaths and multiple funerals. But at the same time, the Shah was also quite ill with cancer and weakened, I would say weaker than he usually would be, because he was not the strongest. He was very smart, but he wasn't the most decisive leader. And he was clearly weakened by his medical problems. In Iran today, there's talk of strikes, but I don't think we've seen the kind of strikes we saw during the Shah's period. We haven't seen the kind of bloodshed that we saw during the end stages during the Shah's period. But we do see Khamenei being apparently quite ill. And what's notable is that he seems to be AWOL. We have just not heard very much from Khamenei. Would you interpret that as because he's ill and debilitated, or is he trying to palm off any violence or upcoming violence onto the replaceable civil government and keep the mullah's hands off of it?
That's a great question, Alex. And again, I can't claim to have any kind of decisive answer here, but having watched him pretty closely in a number of these other situations, my assumption is it's the latter. It's going to be the latter until proven otherwise, because he's done this before during periods of unrest, kind of just disappeared, waits to see how it shakes out, and then comes in. One of the things that he's a master of, and I would say the Iranians in general are masters of, is the theater of power. Khamenei doesn't like to take any position that he's not gonna back up, to demand anything that is not gonna automatically happen, and so in periods of flux, he kind of hangs back, and then when he knows how he wants to act and that he'll get the result that he wants, then he comes forward. So I would just assume that that's the case until we hear, with somebody who has really very good information. And there's so many rumors flying around all the time. When I say really good information, I mean I want to hear the director of the CIA, the director of national intelligence says we have evidence that he's really, in the hospital and incapacitated, and the people around him are fighting. And until I hear that, I'm going to assume otherwise.
Okay. Another bunch of questions that I'll synthesize. You mentioned Brenda Schaefer. She's been circulating what she says is unconfirmed, sort of pamphlets or infographics that from the Iranian intelligence showing the country breaking up. Showing provinces leaving Iran, the dissolution of the Iranian state. And they're circulating this, of course, among their Persian base of support in order to, I think, to scare the Persians, even those who oppose the regime, that the country will break up. And this is not supported. Even opponents of the regime do not want to see Iran go back to being Persia and not being Iran and not having these provinces. So do you think that this will succeed? Do you think that this will succeed at splitting the Persians into groups that will still oppose the regime and those who will back off, even though they hate the regime, because they don't want to see Iran descend into civil war and dissolution?
I think it's a potent weapon. I really do, both in terms of the Persian fear of minorities, number one, or just first of all, let's just say the natural fear of disorder. I mean, it's a natural human. If the government goes down, however bad it is, and then there's chaos, that's there's not a person in the world that's not going to have a little bit of concern about that. And then secondly, you have the Persian concern about the minorities, and traditionally, historically, the fear in Iran of foreign machinations and foreign divisions has been off the charts. And I don't, even though this regime is hated, I don't think I don't think you can get rid of that kind of those kinds of attitudes. You know, there's an article for those of you who have a scholarly bent. You can find it on the web. There's a scholarly article in the Encyclopedia Iranica, and this is kind of the basic reference volume for historians of Iran. There's a full chapter in the Encyclopedia Iranica on conspiracy theories, going all the way back, to certainly to the Safavid period. That's the 16th century. I think even before that. And it makes for, again, if you have a scholarly bent, it makes for very interesting reading, because the fear in Iran that outside powers are going to conspire with fifth columns to weaken Iran is ever present, and so the regime is trying to work with that for sure.
Persians love conspiracy theories.
It's amazing. I don't know how, if I can just tell you a funny story. I had one of the most amazing experiences of my life. In 1989 was when we shot down the the United States Navy shot down the airliner, or it was 88 it was. We shot down the Iranian airliner, and then Khomeini used that as an excuse to end the war with Iraq. He said, I said I wouldn't take this poison pill of making peace with Saddam Hussein, but look, the Americans are now going to destroy us if I don't do this. And I was in Istanbul shortly after that, and it was the vacation, the Bayram religious weekend, and I decided to go to Bulgaria. It was still communist Bulgaria for the weekend, and I ended up on this bus, a bus full of was a bus packed with Iranian soldiers and me. They had all been they'd all, because the war had ended, they were furloughed. And they all went to go, drink and womanize in Istanbul. And some enterprising Iranian guy in Istanbul sold them tickets to Bulgaria and told them that there were, when we got to the border of Bulgaria, all of a sudden, all these guys stood up and they started putting on T-shirts one after another, and then putting a sweatshirt over it. And I said, "What's going on?" And they said, "Well, the women in Bulgaria will sleep with you for a T-shirt," right? So the guy who sold them the ticket to Bulgaria also sold them T-shirts and told them, "You can't believe these beautiful Bulgarian women who love T-shirts." So anyway, these poor guys got taken. So I got but they all wanted to talk about the shoot down of the airliner, and they had one guy who spoke English. I was surrounded by all these Iranian soldiers, and they all wanted to talk about it, and it was fascinating to me to try to figure out how they saw the world, because they kept telling me that the United States took down the Shah and put Khomeini in charge, and so on and so forth. And it was very hard to have a conversation with them, because their view of the world was so different from my own, and it was really unlike anything I've had, any kind of conversation. I've spent a lot of time talking conspiracies with the Arabs, and the Iranians when it comes to conspiracy theories, they make the Arabs look like school children.
Yeah, and if you really want to set them off, they're most impressed with the British secret services, and so
by the way, that was part of my conversation with the soldiers. Explained to me that Reagan decided to get rid of the Shah because the Queen was telling him to. The belief that Britain is still pulling the strings. It's still out there. And if you follow the Iranian news, you'll see that there'll be protests, and the protesters will be protesting Britain. It's really remarkable.
Yep, yep. It's an example of brand survival, no matter what you do to
Yeah,
ruin the brand, it
great
lives on.
brand. The British, Perfidious Albion is a great brand.
That's true. Now, going back to the Obama administration, during the demonstrations, when the students were demonstrating in the streets, in the first, and you've touched on this, I'm just going to give you a chance to expand on it. In the first couple of weeks, they were chanting in Farsi, Obama, because it's very, very close in Farsi to he's with us. And so they were chanting, Obama, Obama. But after a couple of weeks, when they noticed that nothing was happening, they started to chant, where is he? Because it appeared, to put a very uncharitable reading on it, that Obama was more interested in showing that he could negotiate successfully with the Islamic Republic than in replacing the Islamic Republic, and thereby obviating any need for negotiations if a friendly government took its place. Do you see something similar in the Biden administration in their hands-off policy? They've said very, very little. They haven't warned the regime to not engage in violence. It's been very, very little that they've done to support the demonstrators.
No, absolutely. They're I was going to say pro-regime, which is a little bit uncharitable. Not that I really feel like I want to be all that charitable, but it's a little crude, I think, to say they're pro-regime. They are anti being anti-regime. They will not do anything that is going to set them into a serious conflict or tension with the regime. And their gamble here, for all the reasons I said, because that'll lead to these escalations that they don't want, for domestic political reasons, for military reasons, for others, economic reasons. But their gamble here is that the regime will understand that and won't provoke them, and won't do anything that will force their hand and force them to take a position. So, such as an attack on one of our allies, or an attack on some of our forces, to such an extent that we can't cover it up. We've covered up. Nobody can answer me, the people who are here listening, but let me just ask this question. How many of you out there realize that the Iranians attacked American forces in the UAE with a ballistic missile on January 24th of this year? My guess is that it's a minority of you, and you can find the information out there. It's on the web. It wasn't totally hidden. It was an attack by the Houthi militia on the UAE, but there was a ballistic missile that targeted our air wing on the Dhafra base. And the THAAD missile system, this is a good way to look at it if you're interested in. Well, I wrote about this article coming out in Tablet. The administration defined it didn't openly admit that we were attacked by Iran effectively on January 24th. Instead, defined it as a bilateral, terrorism issue between the UAE and the Houthis, and called on the two sides, to sit down and make nice with each other. Again, because if they had admitted that Iran launched a ballistic missile at our men, then they would have to do something about it, and they don't want to. So they're gambling that the Iranians will be smart enough not to do anything like that, and they may be right. Maybe that's what'll happen.
Okay. One issue that has come up in the questions regards the Europeans have created an energy disaster for themselves with their energy policies and their race to get to renewables and to get rid of nuclear and gas, et cetera, which is now just becoming all too obvious. With the winter approaching and with supplies from Russia being cut off. And we also have our own country with oil difficulties and the price of oil being a major irritant to the American public and also to the prospects for the Democrats and the Biden administration. Those two factors, how do you think those might play in terms of negotiations? Well, let me rephrase it. It's possible one could say that the sanctions against Iran are now hurting the Europeans and the Americans more than it's hurting the Iranians. And at least it certainly raised the amount of pain that the sanctions are imposing on those who are imposing the sanctions. Do you think that this is going to lead to enough pressure to make concessions in order to get the JCPOA back on track, in order to roll back the sanctions and open up the energy spigot to the extent that Iran can, to help the Europeans and to help the United States?
Well, I think they have already opened up the spigot to a significant degree in allowing these oil sales to China. I'm not enough of an expert on the Iranian oil market to understand how much lifting of sanctions formally would change the picture, how much more oil it would bring on. My guess is very much a guess, and I hadn't even thought of this question that you've asked. And one of the first things I'm going to do when I get off this call is find out how much capacity is left in the Iranian system. But I think the Iranians have calculated that it's not worth it to them. They're in a kind of the Biden administration, by not negotiating with the Iranians, because this has never been. Some of my friends in Washington, they always say, "Oh, the Biden and Obama people, they're so naive." The common thing you hear is they're like a guy going in to buy a car or a rug and saying, I'm not going to leave here until I get a beautiful rug, and price is no object, and so of course they're gonna once they see how eager you are, they're going to keep jacking up the price. That's not what's going on. That's not what's going on. The administration believes this is. I think this is hard for a lot of people who see Iran as an enemy to grasp. The administration doesn't really see Iran as an enemy. It sees Iran as a country with whom we have a lot of shared interests. A very difficult, a difficult and somewhat adversarial country, but one with whom we share a lot of interests. And if we can find the formulas for sitting down and working out our differences, we can bring down the tension all across the region. They don't believe the rhetoric of the regime when it says that it wants to destroy the American system in the Middle East, that it wants to destroy Israel, and so on. They don't take that seriously. They think that that's just rhetoric, for lip service, and that there's really a pragmatic mind behind the extreme rhetoric that likes America and wants to cut it and wants to cut a deal with it. Alex, you and I have talked about this many times before. It's hard for some people to see that, to believe that anyone believes that, but they believe it. It's not just Democrats. There are a lot of Republicans who believe it too. I've been around all my professional life. I've been around people who see the world this way, so it's very easy for me to imagine it. They hide it, though. They hide it because it's politically unpalatable in the United States. So they pretend that they're trying to do something else rather than what they're actually trying to do, which is to find an accommodation with Iran. And that's why they have never really negotiated hard and tried to put pressure on the regime in any serious way. The problem they run up against is that they're Americans in the end, and there's like they can go very far towards accommodating Iran, but there are certain limits beyond which they can't go. And I mean, they have done. I've been surprised at how far they've gone. Actually, I mean, that they were hiding the fact that there were these open. These, we learned that there were these plots against Pompeo and Brian Hook and John Bolton and others. We only learned about it because of the security detail of Mike Pompeo. The State Department had to ask Congress for additional funding and had to explain what the funding was for, and it got to Congress. That's how they found out. The intelligence community, nobody leaked that this existed. They were quite willing. Now, the administration has known this all along, right? They've known it. They knew it for half a year before it became public knowledge, even more. And they were really trying to cut a deal while these plots were open, and they would have done it if they hadn't been publicly embarrassed about it.
Since it's a bit after 2, I'll ask one final question, and it's a paraphrase, I believe, from Hemingway, that collapses go slowly and then very, very quickly. And we certainly saw that with the Soviet Union. It surprised a lot of people when it finally did collapse. Do you see something similar happening with Iran? In other words, do you think the regime might be actually a lot weaker than it looks internally?
I think the regime is weak. It's a weird thing. I've been searching for a metaphor, and the best I can come up with, it's not the best one, is a rabid dog. A rabid dog is dying, but it's extremely dangerous, and you have to be very careful with it. And I don't think it's the reason the metaphor is no good is that it's not. I don't think it's on its last legs. But it's it's like the Soviet Union. I think that's probably the best metaphor, best comparison. Soviet Union, had nuclear weapons, a big armament. It's a very dangerous thing, but yet very brittle inside, and that's what we're looking at here. Because of this ethnic dynamic and because of the nature of the IRGC. It's in a lot of ways it's a criminal network. It operates in the same way as a criminal network. When you mentioned they're very much aware of the fact that these funerals and then the 40-day the 40-day memorials that take place after the funerals could become a cycle of protest for them, because that's what happened under the Shah. The Shah wasn't cynical and brutal enough to withhold the bodies, but they withhold the bodies and they ransom the bodies, and they make the families bury them without without funerals and so forth, and all kinds of cynical manipulation of bodies in order to get leverage over the families, so that they don't get into these cycles in any way. I expect, on the basis of the way the Iranian Revolution lasted about a year, and I expect that this regime will go down in a similar way. It will be a long, drawn-out process. And I expect the IRGC to have all kinds of clever, violent, manipulative schemes that will be very effective in preventing people from the outside from having any kind of influence, and from splitting the different elements that they have on the inside. The one thing that not just one thing, the Iranians have a lot of talent, but one talent they really do have is identifying fissures among their rivals and playing on it. I had the benefit one time when I worked in the White House of seeing some very some very granular intelligence that we had, the kind that the United States does so well, into the diplomatic strategy of the regime for splitting different Europeans from each other on the nuclear question. And it was so nuanced and so detailed, you know, the difference between the British position and the German position, and the German position and the French. And it just reminded me of a guy with a little tiny hammer looking at cracks in a rock and just tapping away at these cracks to make them a little bigger, a little bigger, a little bigger. They're extremely good at that. And they do it with their own people. They do it with the outside world, and so on. Not always great with the strategy. I think but it just comes naturally to their mind somehow. I don't know why.
I'll ask one final question that comes to mind, and that is, you mentioned the key role that will probably be played by the IRGC. Do you think the loss of Soleimani is going to have a big impact here?
I think that was you know, the phrase, the graveyards are full of indispensable men. To contradict that old saying, I really do think he was the closest thing to an indispensable man. I don't know how much with regard, you know, he was the head of the Quds Force, which is the external arm of the IRGC. I don't know how much it means on the internal stuff, but with regard to the external stuff, he was indispensable. I mean, he was the architect of this very effective strategy of building up all these proxies around the region, and he knew all of the individuals personally, and so on. On the domestic front, I don't know so much. It was a huge blow to lose him. I wish we'd do that, some more of that. But I'm not so sure about the internal stuff.
Well, thank you, Mike, for this a very insightful presentation, and look forward to doing it again when we meet, where you can talk about how the regime collapsed.